The Gestapo tracked her radio for 13 months. She sent 400 messages and disappeared. One transmission too long and you're dead. That's not a figure of speech. That's not something they told you in a classroom to keep your attention. That was the actual rule in Nazi-occupied France. Every second you spent on that radio, a team of German specialists in a truck somewhere nearby was spinning dials, triangulating your signal, narrowing down your position. 20 minutes on the air. That was the limit. After that, the trucks got close enough to put a face with a frequency. After that, the Gestapo knocked on a door. And when the Gestapo knocked on your door in 1943, you didn't open it and have a chat. You disappeared. Into a prison, into a camp, into the ground. The average life expectancy of a special operations executive wireless operator in Nazi-occupied France was 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Let that number sit for a moment. 6 weeks. That's barely enough time to learn your neighbors' names, let alone build a spy network, coordinate arms drops for resistance fighters, and keep an entire underground circuit alive while the most feared intelligence apparatus in Europe is actively trying to find you. 6 weeks was the average. Some operators were caught faster. A handful lasted longer. Very few lasted what came next. One woman beat those odds for 13 months straight. She wasn't a trained soldier. She wasn't a hardened intelligence officer who had been doing this her whole career with 15 years of field experience behind her. She was a young widow, barely in her 30s, who had just lost her husband, nearly lost her own life in a German bombing raid on her home, and still had a 2-year-old daughter she had to send away to a convent for safekeeping before she could even think about the mission. She parachuted into the French countryside on a dark August night, lugging a radio in a suitcase, carrying codes written on silk handkerchiefs hidden in a secret pocket of her briefcase, and not a single cyanide pill anywhere on her because she had made up her mind. She was not going to get caught. Her name was Yvonne Cormeau. Her code name was Annette. And in 13 months of continuous operation inside one of the most dangerous environments of the entire Second World War, she sent over 400 messages to London, more than almost any other wireless operator the SOE ever deployed into the field. Leo Marx, the SOE's own chief cryptographer, the man who designed the coding systems used by agents across occupied Europe and who reviewed every transmission that came through, put it in writing after the war. In over 400 transmissions, Yvonne Cormeau never made a single mistake, not one. Not across 400 transmissions, not in 13 months. The Gestapo hunted her the entire time. They had wanted posters with her face on them tacked to walls across the region. They had direction-finding trucks rolling through the villages, scanning the airwaves. They had informants, checkpoints, roadblocks, interrogations. They had everything. And they came up empty, 13 months in a row. When the war in southwest France was finally over, Yvonne gathered her things, climbed into a car with her circuit commander, and drove into the liberated city of Toulouse, with American and British flags flying from the windows. She had won. This is her story, and it deserves every minute you're about to give it. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand how this woman survived what she survived, you have to understand what she came from. What kind of life shapes a person who can parachute into enemy territory alone, operate a clandestine radio network for over a year in constant danger, and never crack under pressure? Because people like Yvonne Cormeau don't happen by accident. They are built by experience, long before the war gives them a stage. Yvonne was born Beatrice Yvonne Biesterfeld on December 18th, 1909. And right away, her life was unusual. She was born in Shanghai, China, Her father was a Belgian consular official, the kind of man who lived his life moving from one foreign posting to another, carrying his family across time zones and cultures the way other men carry a briefcase to the office. Her mother was Scottish. From the very beginning, Yvonne existed between worlds, between cultures, between countries. She was not from one place. She was from everywhere, and that meant she truly belonged nowhere, which is, as it turns out, almost exactly the right background for a spy. She grew up speaking French, English, and German, not learned from a textbook, not acquired in an evening class. Native fluency, the kind that comes from actually living inside a language, thinking in it, dreaming in it, instinctively feeling when a sentence sounds right and when it carries the slight wrongness of a foreigner who has memorized the words but not the rhythm. She was educated. In Belgium and Scotland, two countries with very different characters, very different social codes, very different ideas about what is acceptable and what draws suspicion. By the time she was a young adult, she had lived in more countries than most people ever visit. That upbringing gave her something that would later save her life, again and again. She understood how people thought across different cultures. She understood the rhythms, the habits, the social rules that people follow without knowing they follow them. She knew how to fit in. She knew how to become invisible in a crowd. She knew which stories sounded plausible and which ones, however accurate the details, sounded slightly off in a way that made people pause and look twice. For a spy, those instincts are not optional. They are the difference between coming home and never being heard from again. She also understood something more fundamental, that people believe what they expect to see. If you look the part, carry yourself the right way, and give an answer to a question before the suspicion fully forms in someone's mind, you control the encounter. You are not a suspect being questioned. You are a person being inconvenienced. That distinction, that split second of social framing, is the difference between a checkpoint being a problem and a checkpoint being a minor irritation on an otherwise normal day. In 1937, she married Charles-Émile Cormeau, a chartered accountant living in London. By all accounts, it was a genuinely happy marriage, the kind built on steady affection and mutual respect rather than grand gestures. Charles was practical, grounded, the kind of man who made a home feel like a home. Yvonne worked, built a life, and settled into London with the contentment of someone who had spent her whole childhood on the move and was finally, for the first time, putting down roots somewhere. By 1939, she was pregnant and thinking about the future the way you do when you believe the future is going to look more or less like the present. Then the war came. Charles enlisted right away. He joined the Rifle Brigade, a British Army infantry regiment with a long history and a good reputation, the kind of regiment that a practical, steady man like Charles Cormeau would have chosen. He was sent to France, into the fighting, and in 1940 he was wounded. The wound was serious enough to get him evacuated back to England. Yvonne was relieved. He had made it back. They were going to be okay. They thought the worst was behind them. They were wrong. The Blitz hit London like a hammer that fall. The Luftwaffe came at night, night after night after night. German bombers above the city, the wail of air raid sirens, people running for shelters, and bombs falling on neighborhoods, on houses, on people asleep in their beds. London in the Blitz was not just frightening. It was a sustained assault on the basic assumption that you would still exist tomorrow. You went to sleep not knowing if you would wake up. You came home from work not knowing if there would be a home to come back to. One night in 1940 or early 1941, the precise date is not clearly established in the historical record, a German bomb destroyed the Cormeau family home in London. Charles was killed. Their home was gone. Yvonne's unborn baby was killed. Yvonne herself survived because of something so random, so strange, that it sounds like a detail invented to make the story more dramatic. A bathtub from the upper floor of the house fell over her when the building came down, and it formed a kind of protective shell around her, keeping the debris that killed everything else around her from crushing her. She survived, buried under her own destroyed home, because a bathtub fell at exactly the right angle. You couldn't write that. You just couldn't. She was a widow at 31. She was grieving in a city that was itself grieving, surrounded by people who had all lost something. She had a 2-year-old daughter, Yvette, who needed to be kept safe. She was also, in that moment, absolutely and completely done waiting for the war to come to her. She sent Yvette to the countryside, to a convent of Ursuline nuns in Oxfordshire. It was the hardest thing she ever did, she said later. Handing your 2-year-old to women you barely know, in a place you have never been, and walking away. Knowing that where you are going, you might not come back from. That your little girl might grow up to be told a story about a mother she barely remembers. Most people, facing that moment, would have stopped right there, gone somewhere safe, waited it out, tried to survive intact. Let younger, childless people, people with nothing to lose, do the dangerous work. Yvonne made a different calculation. She did not go somewhere safe. In November 1941, she joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force as an administrator. She was going to fight this war from inside, from as close to the action as anyone would let her get. While she was stationed at a Royal Air Force base called RAF Swinderby in Lincolnshire, she saw a notice posted on the bulletin board. It was a call for linguists, people who spoke multiple languages and were willing to take on unusual and demanding assignments. The notice was vague in the way that all notices for secret work are vague. It didn't say what the unusual assignments were. Most people walked past without stopping. Yvonne stopped and read it carefully, and she decided she was the person that notice was meant for. She answered the call. What she had answered, though she did not know it at the time, was a recruitment notice from the Special Operations Executive. The SOE Winston Churchill's secret army, the organization he famously ordered to, quote, set Europe ablaze. The SOE operated entirely in the shadows, sending agents behind enemy lines to organize resistance movements, conduct sabotage operations, gather intelligence, and in some cases commit acts of violence that the regular military could never officially sanction or acknowledge. It was dangerous. It was unglamorous. It offered no glory, no parades, no public recognition. It simply required people who could think under pressure, operate without support, and keep their mouths shut indefinitely. Yvonne was exactly what they were looking for. The languages alone would have made her valuable. The background, the ability to move between cultures without friction, made her exceptional. The recent personal loss, the husband dead, the home destroyed, the child put away in a convent for safekeeping, that made her motivated in a way that is very hard to manufacture in a person who has not lived it. She was going into France. She had already lost everything the Germans could take from her in London. There was nothing left to take except her life, and she had already decided that was a risk she was prepared to accept. She began her training as an SOEF section wireless operator on February 15th, 1943. F section meant France. That was the destination. And F section was where many of the most dangerous SOE deployments were concentrated because France was densely occupied, with German security forces, the Gestapo, the Milice, the French paramilitary police force that in some ways was even more dangerous than the Germans because they knew the locals, they knew the terrain, and they knew the ways ordinary French people actually behaved, all of them actively hunting British-backed agents. SOE training was not a gentle introduction to spy work. It was a sequence of rigorous courses designed to teach people skills most of them had never imagined needing: physical fitness, parachute technique, silent movement and field craft, weapons handling, explosives and sabotage, the psychology of interrogation, how the enemy would try to break you, and what mental techniques you could use to endure it as long as possible, map reading, navigation, emergency communication, and wireless operation. She learned everything a wireless operator needed to know: how to set up the equipment quickly and quietly, in conditions ranging from the cellar of a French farmhouse to an open field at night; how to extend the aerial without drawing attention, threading wire through whatever vegetation or infrastructure was available; how to encode and decode messages using the SOE's cipher systems, complex processes that had to be performed without error, because a mistake in the cipher meant the message was unreadable on the other end and a repeat transmission was required. And repeat transmissions cost time. Time on the air cost safety. She learned how to compress a transmission down to the absolute minimum, stripping messages to their essential intelligence and nothing more. She learned how to switch frequencies, how to handle equipment failures in the field, how to improvise. And most importantly, she learned how to operate at speed. The faster you could send, the less time you were on the air, and the less time the Germans had to lock onto your signal and triangulate your position. The average SOE wireless operator could send 12 words per minute in Morse code. That was the standard. That was what training produced in most people. Yvonne trained relentlessly until she could do 18 to 22 words per minute. That gap, those extra 6 to 10 words per minute, is not just a technical benchmark. It represents actual survival time. Every additional word per minute faster meant less time on the air. Less time on the air meant harder to track. Harder to track meant harder to catch. In that business, harder to catch meant still breathing. The arithmetic of survival in occupied France was that stark and that simple. The SOE also trained its agents in something harder to measure than Morse speed or coding technique. They trained them in how to think under pressure, how to respond to a sudden confrontation, an unexpected question, a piece of information that should not, by any logic, be true. Because in the field, the challenge is rarely the one you planned for. It is the one that appears out of nowhere. The neighbor who was supposed to be away who is standing in the doorway. The checkpoint that was not on any recent intelligence report. The German officer at the cafe table next to you who seems to be listening a little too carefully to your conversation. You cannot plan for those moments. But you can train your mind to stay inside your cover identity so completely that the response comes from instinct rather than calculation. Calculation takes a moment too long. A moment too long gets you caught. She trained alongside 2 other women, Yolande Beekman and Noor Inayat Khan. All 3 of them were preparing to parachute into France and work as wireless operators behind enemy lines. Now, before we go further, I want you to hold on to those 2 names, Yolande Beekman and Noor Inayat Khan, because they were brave beyond measure. They both went into France and did extraordinary work, and they both ended up in Nazi concentration camps. Noor Inayat Khan, who the British sometimes called the bravest of them all, was executed at Dachau in September 1944. Yolande Beekman was executed at Dachau the same day, alongside 3 other SOE women. Of the 3 women who trained together in early 1943, only one survived the war. That was Yvonne Cormeau. Sit with that for a second. The same training class, the same mission, 3 women doing the same job in the same country for the same organization. 2 of them did not come home. One of them sent 400 perfect messages and drove into Toulouse waving a flag. The difference wasn't luck. Not entirely. It was skill and discipline and judgment, day after day after day for 13 months. But we'll get to that. On the night of August 22nd, 1943, Yvonne Cormeau walked across the tarmac at RAF Tempsford, a Royal Air Force base in Bedfordshire that served as the launching point for SOE agents going into France. She climbed into a Halifax bomber operated by No. 161 Squadron. She was wearing civilian clothes. She had her radio equipment in a suitcase. Her codes were written on silk handkerchiefs hidden in a secret pocket of her briefcase because paper codes were bulky, and if you got wet, they were ruined. Silk stayed intact. She had a .22 revolver, and she did not have a cyanide pill. The SOE offered cyanide pills to every agent they sent into the field. L-pills, they called them. The idea was simple. If you were captured and the interrogation started going badly, you had a way out. You would not break. You would not give up names and addresses and safe houses under torture. You had the option. Yvonne said no. She refused the pill before she left England. She made a different calculation. She was going to be careful enough not to get caught, and if somehow she did get caught, she would find another way. You want to know something? She was right. The Halifax flew through the dark toward southern France. Somewhere below, the occupied countryside rolled past in the blackness. Then the jumpmaster gave the signal, the hatch opened, and Yvonne jumped. She fell through the cold night air above the Bordeaux region and landed in a field near a village called Saint-Antoine-du-Queyret, about 45 kilometers east of Bordeaux. She gathered her parachute in the dark, made contact with the reception committee waiting for her, and went to work. Her assignment was to operate as the wireless operator for the wheelwright circuit, an SOE resistance network covering a large swath of Gascony in southwestern France. The circuit commander was a man named George Starr. His code name was Hilaire. As it happened, Yvonne already knew him from before the war when they had both been living in Brussels. It was a small world, even in wartime, even in occupied France. Starr was tough, experienced, and meticulous. He had been in France, already for months, building the wheelwright network from scratch, recruiting local resistance fighters, organizing supply drops, laying the groundwork for eventually raising a small army when the Allied invasion came. He needed good communication with London more than he needed almost anything else. Supplies, intelligence assessments, orders, timing of operations, all of it depended on the wireless link. Without a reliable operator, the whole network was flying blind. He had Yvonne now, and she was about as reliable as they came. One of the first things Starr told her when she arrived, "Do not carry that revolver. She had it with her when she jumped." He took one look at the situation and told her to leave it behind. "If you are stopped by the Germans," he explained, "a woman carrying a firearm is a death sentence, no discussion, no questions asked. The pistol stays hidden. You rely on your cover story and your papers, not a gun." It was exactly the kind of advice Yvonne had come to France to receive. She put the revolver away and never carried it in the field. Starr was right. The gun would have gotten her killed. The cover story kept her alive. Now, I want to explain something to you, because if you've never thought about what it actually took to operate a clandestine radio in Nazi-occupied France, the sheer mechanical reality of it, it will change how you see what Yvonne did every single day for 13 months. The standard wireless set issued to SOE operators was called the B Mark II. It was a heavy, cumbersome machine, 14 kilograms, that's 31 pounds, packed into a suitcase. To use it, you had to extend a 20-meter wire aerial. That's 66 feet of wire that had to go somewhere, strung up somewhere plausible, somewhere that didn't attract attention. Yvonne often stretched it through vineyards when she was working in rural areas, a wire running through grapevines, just part of the farm equipment, to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. The machine needed power, a sea household current or a car battery. Yvonne preferred the battery because she believed correctly that it was harder for the Germans to trace than a hard-wired connection to the local power grid. The villages she worked in often didn't have electricity anyway, so the battery was frequently the only option. Early in her mission, SOE upgraded her equipment. They dropped a newer, lighter model, the Type A MK3, which fit in an attaché case and weighed only 4 kilograms. That was a significant improvement. Easier to carry on a bicycle, easier to explain if you were stopped, easier to move in a hurry, because moving was the whole game. The rules for wireless operators in the SOE were not complicated, but they were absolute. Transmit for no more than 20 minutes. Transmit infrequently. Never, ever transmit from the same location twice in a row. Change locations as often as possible. The ideal, the SOE manual said, was for the wireless operator to do nothing but wireless work, to see the circuit commander as little as possible, and to have contact with the fewest possible number of people in the network. In other words, operate alone, stay invisible, keep moving. The reason for all this was the direction-finding trucks. The Germans deployed mobile direction-finding units throughout occupied France, vans and trucks, fitted with antenna equipment that could detect a transmission in progress and triangulate the source. They were good at it, and they got better as the war went on. If you stayed on the air too long, they could narrow it down to a neighborhood. If you stayed in the same place second time, they could narrow it down to a street. Third time, a building. So Yvonne kept moving. She was scheduled for 3 wireless transmissions per week. Each one also required coding and decoding time, encrypting the messages before transmission, and deciphering incoming traffic from London. She changed her location constantly, staying at any given house no longer than 3 days. And because the wheelwright circuit covered an enormous geographic area, she often had to bicycle up to 50 kilometers to change residences. 50 kilometers on a bicycle through the French countryside, with a radio transmitter in a case attached to the back, in a country occupied by the German army. She did that week after week, for 13 months. If you're from a generation of Americans who built things with their hands, who drove trucks before power steering, who know what real physical work feels like, you can appreciate what that takes in the bones. That is not a desk job. That is not pushing papers. That is grinding, punishing, relentless physical and mental effort sustained for over a year in constant mortal danger. Hey, before we go further, real quick, if you're finding this story as gripping as I am, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I put out stories like this every week. Real people, real wars, the moments history books skip over. The men who watch this channel tell me these are the stories nobody told them when they were growing up. And they're right. Hit subscribe and you won't miss any of them. This one is really just getting started. Let me tell you how Yvonne covered her tracks on the ground, because having a reason to be moving around is just as important as actually moving around. In an occupied country, strange faces attract attention. Strangers on bicycles attract checkpoints. Questions get asked. Papers get checked. You need a story that holds up, one that doesn't just sound plausible, but actually fits your behavior perfectly. Yvonne identified herself as a district nurse. Think about that for a moment. It is a brilliant cover story, and not just because it's simple. A district nurse in rural France in the 1940s was someone who traveled constantly from village to village, carrying a bag with medical equipment, showing up at farmhouses and small homes at all hours to check on patients. She would be expected to be a stranger in any given village. She would be expected to move frequently. She would be expected to carry a case of some kind. She would have a legitimate reason to be anywhere. And she would be someone that ordinary French civilians were instinctively inclined to cooperate with and protect, rather than report to the authorities. It was the perfect cover, and she played it consistently, day after day, at checkpoint after checkpoint. In those first months in France, she also worked as a courier for Star in addition to her wireless duties. She carried messages, delivered materials, scouted locations. She identified fields that could be used for parachute supply drops and aircraft landings, then sent the coordinates to London. She was not just a link between France and England. She was an active, essential part of the entire operation. And all the while the Gestapo was looking for her. Not personally, not yet, at least not by name. But they knew there was an English wireless operator in their region. They could hear the transmissions. Every time she went on the air, their direction-finding equipment tried to find her. Every time they triangulated to a general area, they sent men to search. And every time, she had already moved on. It was a game of cat and mouse played across an entire province, and Yvonne was very, very good at it. Then, at some point in those first months, someone gave her up. An agent in the network, operating under the code name Rodolphe, was compromised. Whether he broke under interrogation, whether he was turned by the Germans, and working as a double agent, the historical record is not entirely clear. What is clear is that Yvonne received intelligence that she had been betrayed, that her identity, or at least a description of her, had been passed to the Gestapo. She didn't run. She tightened her procedures and kept working, and then came the wanted posters. They appeared on walls around her operating area. German-issued posters, sketched from descriptions provided by informants, and the sketches, according to people who knew her, were accurate. Her face, her approximate age, her general appearance, reproduced on paper and tacked to walls across the region with instructions that she was to be apprehended immediately. Yvonne Cormeau looked at those posters and kept transmitting. If that doesn't earn a person your respect, I don't know what does. The roadblock incident is one of the moments that has lived in SOE history ever since, because it captures something essential about who Yvonne Cormeau was and how she operated under pressure. At some point during her time in France, she and George Starr were traveling together when they ran into a German checkpoint. Not the kind of checkpoint you slow down for and wave at. A serious one. Armed soldiers, papers being checked, a gun pressed against someone's back. Both of them were stopped. Both were questioned. Yvonne had her cover story. She was a district nurse, and she had false identification papers prepared by the SOE specifically for this kind of situation. But she also had one major problem. Her radio equipment was right there with her. The Germans started asking about the case. Yvonne looked at the soldier and told him it was an X-ray machine. She was a district nurse, she explained. She needed the equipment to care for patients in rural areas where hospitals were far away. An X-ray machine, in a small case, carried by a district nurse on her rounds. The soldier looked at the case, looked at the papers, looked at Yvonne, looked back at the papers, and he let them go. That is the moment you remember. Not because it was the most dramatic thing Yvonne ever did, but because of what it took to pull it off. To stand at a checkpoint with a gun pressed to your back, knowing that if the soldier opened that case and had any idea what he was looking at, it was over. and to deliver that explanation with enough calm, enough certainty, enough believability that a trained German soldier believed you. No trembling voice, no hesitation, just a nurse with her equipment, irritated at the inconvenience of being stopped on her rounds. Later, she described what it was like. She talked about training her mind to stay in the story completely. If you believed it fully, in the moment, the other person felt that belief. The moment you had a flicker of doubt, they felt that too. So you had no doubt. You were a nurse. That was all there was. 13 months, hundreds of checkpoints, hundreds of moments like that. Every single one of them survived. I want to talk about something that I think gets lost when people discuss World War II intelligence operations, and that is the loneliness. The SOE's own instructions said it plainly. The ideal wireless operator should see the circuit commander as little as possible and have contact with the fewest possible number of people. That was the rule that kept you alive. Fewer contacts meant fewer people who could betray you, whether willingly or under duress. Fewer contacts meant fewer faces that could be placed at multiple locations, connecting the dots for a Gestapo investigator. So Yvonne worked largely alone. She moved from farmhouse to farmhouse, never staying more than 3 days. The rural French families who sheltered her were risking their own lives to do so. She was careful never to endanger them any more than necessary. She was careful never to stay long enough that a nosy neighbor or a local informant could put a pattern together. She received word from London. She sent word to London. She encoded, transmitted, decoded, moved. Encoded, transmitted, decoded, moved. There is a kind of grinding, solitary courage in that kind of work that is very different from the courage of a man in a trench under artillery fire. It's not the courage that gets celebrated in the big dramatic moments, though those moments came too. It's the courage of doing the exact same dangerous thing correctly, without shortcuts, without complaints, without the company of anyone who fully understands what you are doing and what it costs day after day for over a year. No one to debrief to at the end of the day. No one to confirm that you made the right call. Just you, the radio, the codes, and the dark. Think about what it actually looked like on a Tuesday afternoon in October 1943, somewhere in rural Gascony. Yvonne is in a farmhouse that isn't hers. The family who owns it is nervous because they know what she is even if they don't know exactly what she's doing. The aerial is stretched through the vineyard outside. She has 20 minutes. She encodes the message on her silk handkerchief cipher, taps it out in Morse at 20 words per minute, listens for London's acknowledgement, closes down the set, packs everything back into the attaché case, and then she gets on her bicycle and rides away, maybe 50 kilometers to the next place. Nobody clapping, nobody watching. Just a woman on a bicycle on a French country road with a radio transmitter that is a death sentence in a case strapped to the back. Most people, even brave people, cannot maintain that kind of sustained performance under sustained pressure. The mind looks for relief, the discipline slips. A shortcut seems reasonable this once. You tell yourself you'll move tomorrow instead of today. You skip a precaution because you're tired and it's cold, and you've been doing this for 8 months, and nothing bad has happened yet. These are the moments that got people killed in occupied France. Not dramatic acts of recklessness, just the slow erosion of discipline under the weight of exhaustion and isolation. Yvonne Cormeau's discipline never slipped. There is actually one documented case where she broke one of the cardinal wireless security rules, and the outcome of it is almost darkly funny in the grim way that only wartime stories can be. By early 1944, as it became clear that the Allied invasion of France was approaching, Starr needed the wireless link more active than ever. Yvonne began transmitting more frequently, and at some point she started transmitting from the same location for extended periods. A hilltop village called Castelnau-sur-Lovignon, where Starr had established his headquarters. She ended up transmitting from that same house for 6 consecutive months. 6 months, in one place, with the Gestapo direction-finding trucks actively hunting her signal. According to M.R.D. Foote, the official historian of the SOE, there was a very specific reason she survived it. The village of Castelnau was so isolated, so high on its hill, that from the window where she worked she could see for 3 miles in every direction. Any vehicle coming toward her was visible long before it could be a problem. But there was something else, too, something almost absurd. The village had no running water. The German direction-finding teams, for all their sophistication, had one critical weakness. They were looking for a wireless operator in a place that had electricity because they assumed the equipment needed to be plugged in. A village without running water was also a village without significant infrastructure. It wasn't on any list of places worth searching. Nobody in the German command structure thought to look for an English spy in a medieval hilltop village where you had to haul your water up from somewhere else. For 6 months, Yvonne sat in that window with her 3-mile view, encoding messages about Maquis operations and arms drop coordinates and German troop movements, and the Germans never once came for her. Hey, we're right around the midpoint here, and I want to take one quick second to say, if this story is doing something for you, if this is the kind of history that you wish you'd been taught, go ahead and subscribe. It's free. It costs you nothing, and it means I can keep making these for you. There are more stories like this one. Women who flew without instruments, women who crossed enemy lines on foot, women who kept entire intelligence networks running on nothing but nerve and ingenuity. Subscribe and you'll get all of them. All right, back to Yvonne. By the spring of 1944, Yvonne had been in France for about 8 months. The wheelwright circuit under George Starr had grown into something substantial. It wasn't just a small cell of a few people passing papers around. It was a serious, organized resistance operation, one of the most effective in all of occupied France. Starr had a rare talent for organizing people, for finding the right men in the right places and giving them roles that matched their personalities and their local knowledge. He had built connections with resistance leaders across an enormous geographic area stretching from the Lot-et-Garonne down through the Gers and into the foothills of the Pyrenees. He had also built, over months of careful work, a growing force of Maquis fighters. The Maquis were the armed resistors of rural France, young men mostly, farmers and foresters and vineyard workers who had refused the forced labor orders the German occupiers imposed on the French civilian population and had gone into hiding in the countryside rather than be shipped off to Germany to work in war factories. These men were courageous and motivated. What they lacked was weapons, supplies, money, training, and most critically, a reliable connection to Allied command. Starr's job, and Yvonne's job as the wireless link to London, was to provide all of those things, one coded message and one parachute drop at a time. That signal depended entirely on Yvonne's radio. The arms drops that kept the Maquis supplied were coordinated through her transmissions. The timing intelligence from London that told Starr what the Allied planners needed and when they needed it, transmitted through her. The messages from individual resistance leaders about German positions, troop movements, vulnerable targets, encoded by her, sent by her, received and decoded by her. When London needed to know how many fighters Starr could put in the field and in what time frame, that question was answered through Yvonne. When Starr needed equipment, funds, or new personnel delivered by parachute, those requests were sent through Yvonne. She wasn't just a technical function. She was the nervous system of the entire operation. Every part of the circuit ran on information, and information only traveled one way reliably. Through Yvonne's briefcase, across her silk handkerchief codes, through the crackle of Morse code at 18 to 22 words per minute. The SOE's official record shows that by the end of her mission, Yvonne Cormeau had sent over 400 messages. To put that in perspective, she was the second most prolific wireless operator in all of SOEF section, surpassed only by Auguste Floiras of the Jockey Network, who operated for a longer total period of time. Over 400 messages, and according to Leo Marks, the SOE's chief cryptographer, the man who reviewed all transmissions, she never made a single coding error. Not one, in over 400 messages across 13 months. In the intelligence world, that matters more than you might think. A coding error is not just an inconvenience. It means the message cannot be decoded on the receiving end in London. Repeat transmissions are required to clarify or resend. That means more time on the air. More time on the air means greater opportunity for German direction-finding equipment to lock onto the signal. And in the cascade of consequences that follows, systematic coding errors would have cost Yvonne the very thing she had preserved so carefully through every close call and near capture, her freedom and possibly her life. Yvonne charged nothing to that ledger. As D-Day approached and the Allied invasion of Normandy was anticipated throughout the spring of 1944, the tempo of resistance activity across all of France accelerated dramatically. Every circuit, every network, every scattered band of fighters was being readied for the moment when the invasion began, and the orders went out to rise up simultaneously. Cut supply lines, blow bridges, destroy rail junctions, harass German reinforcements trying to reach Normandy from the south and the west. The instructions coming from SOE London became more detailed, more urgent, more precisely timed. The window for preparation was closing fast. Starr's wheelwright circuit was no different. The preparations intensified. The Maquis were receiving more supply drops, more weapons, more plastic explosive. Specific targets were being identified, plans were being laid. The Germans, meanwhile, were doing their own preparations, aware that an Allied invasion was coming somewhere in Europe, uncertain exactly when and where, and increasingly nervous about the resistance activity they could feel building in the countryside around them. Yvonne's workload intensified with all of it. She went from 3 transmissions per week to several transmissions per day. She coordinated supply drops for the Maquis. She provided coordinates of suitable drop zones and landing fields across the region. She assisted in operations that damaged German infrastructure, power lines cut, telephone cables severed, railway lines blown. The Wehrmacht Group G garrison near Toulouse found itself increasingly isolated because key communication cables had been destroyed. Operations that were planned and coordinated through Yvonne's transmissions long before a single German soldier understood what was happening. Every night, the BBC broadcast a series of coded personal messages, seemingly random sentences that actually contained instructions for resistance circuits across France. When D-Day came on, June 6, 1944, and the specific messages went out that night, resistance fighters across southwestern France started acting on plans built in no small part through Yvonne's 400 messages to London. Bridges were attacked, railway lines were cut, telephone exchanges were sabotaged. German reinforcements discovered that the roads they needed were blocked and the rails they needed were broken. She had spent 13 months preparing for this moment. When it came, every message she had ever sent meant something. Then she got shot. June 1944. The German forces in southwestern France were not passive bystanders watching the world change around them. As the invasion in Normandy made clear that the tide was turning, and it was turning, slowly but unmistakably, German commanders in the interior of France grew increasingly ruthless and increasingly desperate. When you're losing a war, the one thing you still control is the cruelty of your response to the people making you lose it. Sweeps through the countryside, raids on villages suspected of harboring Maquis fighters, military operations against resistance hideouts, reprisals against civilians in areas where sabotage had occurred. The Germans weren't giving up the south of France without blood. There were sweeps, attacks on known resistance areas, military operations against the Maquis hideouts in the hills. One of those attacks hit Castelnau-sur-Louvignon. Yvonne was in the village when the attack came. She grabbed her wireless set and ran. Gunfire, chaos. She was making her escape through the village when she was hit in the leg. A bullet went through her. She went down. She was bleeding, and she was still carrying the radio. She got back up. She managed to escape with the wireless equipment still in her possession. The wound was serious enough that she needed medical attention, significant enough that she could not simply ignore it and keep moving. She was treated and she recovered. But she kept operating throughout. The circuit did not go silent. The link to London did not break. The dress she was wearing that day, blood-stained, and the briefcase she was carrying, also marked by blood, are currently on permanent display at the Imperial War Museum in London. They sit there alongside her Women's Auxiliary Air Force officer's uniform, alongside her medals and her documents. If you ever find yourself in London, you can walk into that museum and look at the physical evidence of what she went through. The blood on that fabric is real. The story it tells is real. She got shot escaping a German military attack on her village with her radio in her hands, and she got up and kept going. If you haven't subscribed yet, seriously, do it now. Stories like this deserve an audience, and you deserve to hear more of them. Hit that subscribe button. It helps this channel keep going, and it means you won't miss whatever comes next. I appreciate every single one of you who watches these. Now let's finish this. By August 1944, the situation in southwestern France was shifting rapidly. Allied forces had landed in Provence in mid-August as part of Operation Dragoon, pushing northward through the south of France. The German position in the southwest became untenable. Resistance groups that had been biding their time in the hills and villages began to consolidate and move into the cities. On August 21, 1944, Toulouse fell to the French forces of the interior, the umbrella organization that encompassed the various resistance groups, including Starr's wheelwright fighters. The liberation of an entire major French city. George Starr and Yvonne Cormeau drove into Toulouse together. Their car had American flags and British flags flying from it. After 13 months of hiding in farmhouses, moving by night, ducking checkpoints, transmitting in secret, and evading the full resources of the German intelligence apparatus, they drove into a liberated city in broad daylight. I want you to picture that for a moment. 13 months of that pressure, and then that. The flags on the car, the people in the streets, the knowledge that it was over. Yvonne later described the liberation with the same directness that characterized everything she did. There was no florid celebration in her words, no dramatic retrospective. It was done. She had done it. The network had held. Southwest France was free. On September 25th, 1944, Yvonne Cormeau and George Starr left France. 9 days after a spat between Starr and Charles de Gaulle led the French leader to order the British officers out of the country. That is the kind of footnote that makes you smile a little. Survived the Gestapo for 13 months, ousted by a political argument with de Gaulle. She was flown back to England and reunited with her daughter Yvette, now 5 years old and still in the convent in Oxfordshire. She had last seen her when the girl was 2. 3 years apart. 3 years in which Yvonne had been fighting a secret war in an occupied country, and the child had been growing up in a convent, not knowing any of it. What that reunion was like, Yvonne kept largely to herself, but it is not hard to imagine. After the war, the medals came, and they should have. The British government appointed her a member of the Order of the British Empire. The French government awarded her the Légion d'honneur, the Croix de guerre, and the Médaille de la Résistance, 4 separate honors from 2 governments, none of which fully captured what she had actually done. She went back to work. She became a translator and worked in the SOE section at the Foreign Office. The war was over, but the business of wrapping up what the SOE had done, accounting for agents, reviewing records, making sense of what had happened, that continued. She was part of it. She knew it better than almost anyone. She became a fixture in F-section veteran circles, organizing the annual Bastille Day dinner that brought together the survivors. And the survivors were a smaller group than most people realized, because the attrition among SOE agents had been staggering. She was one of the ones who came back. She helped keep the memory of those who didn't come back alive. One of the early members of the Special Forces Club in London. A committee member who promoted Anglo-French relations and ensured that the contributions of the French resistance and the SOE were not forgotten in the decades after the war. In her 70s, she married again to a man named James Edgar Farrow. They lived in Derbyshire in the English Midlands. In her later years, she lived in Fleet, Hampshire. In 1989, she was surprised by the host of the British television program This Is Your Life, which brought people together to celebrate significant figures by surprising them with their own history told by the people from their lives. Yvonne Cormeau, then 80 years old, sat in front of a television audience and watched pieces of her story be laid out in public. Her surviving friends, her family, the people who knew what she had done. It is something to imagine. The woman who had spent 13 months making herself invisible, finally seen. She was also consulted for the film Charlotte Gray, a story about a young British woman working with the French resistance. The filmmakers described Yvonne as the real Charlotte, the actual person behind the character. She was an advisor to the BBC television series Wish Me Luck, which dramatized the lives of SOE women agents. Her expertise, her experience, her memory were irreplaceable. Yvonne Cormeau died on December 25, 1997. Christmas Day. She was 88 years old. She was survived by her daughter Yvette. Her memorial service was attended by representatives from both the British and French governments. The woman who had once hidden in a farmhouse with a suitcase full of radio equipment was given the kind of farewell that heads of state receive. She deserved every bit of it, and she would have been the first to deflect the attention to someone else. Now I want to take a step back and tell you what I think all this actually means, not as history, but as a story about a specific kind of person, because I think there is something here that speaks directly to the kind of men who watch this channel. The men who grew up in a different America, an America where people solved problems instead of talking about them, where a handshake meant something, where the measure of a person was what they actually did when it got hard. You men who grew up watching your fathers and your grandfathers deal with the real world. The ones who did honest work and kept their word and did not complain about how hard things were. Who understood that sometimes you just have to do the job and do it right every single day, regardless of how you feel. Those are the people Yvonne Cormeau reminds me of. She was not a superhero. She wasn't some fictional unstoppable warrior from a movie poster. She was a woman who had lost everything: husband, unborn child, home, normal life, and decided that loss was not going to be the end of her story. She applied herself, She trained hard enough to outperform everyone around her. She thought clearly under pressure. She made smart decisions in moments that would have broken most people. And she showed up every single day and did the work. No applause, no audience, no guarantee she was going to make it home. 13 months, 400 messages, not one mistake. She also understood something about the difference between being brave and being reckless. There is a misunderstanding, especially in how war is portrayed in movies, that bravery and recklessness are the same thing, that the hero is the one who charges in, ignores the danger, refuses to think about consequences. That is not what Yvonne did. She was genuinely brave. The roadblock, the wanted posters, the gunshot wound in the leg, the 6 months in one village with direction-finding trucks rolling through the countryside. But she was also deeply disciplined and precise. She followed the rules when the rules made sense. She bent the rules when the circumstances demanded it, and she had calculated the risk carefully. She turned down the cyanide pill not out of bravado, but out of a clear-eyed assessment. She was not going to get caught, so she didn't need it. And she was right. She wasn't caught. Think about the contrast with her training classmates. Noor Inayat Khan was brave to the point of sacrifice. Her handlers at the SOE worried about her judgment even before she deployed, wondered whether she had the precise, hard-edged discipline required for wireless operator work specifically. She was good-hearted, idealistic, deeply committed to the cause. She died in Dachau on September 13, 1944, executed at 30 years old. Yolande Beekman, courageous, talented, killed the same day as Noor at the same camp. These were not lesser people than Yvonne. They were extraordinary people who ran out of luck, but something in the specific combination of skills and habits and instincts that Yvonne brought to the work day after day kept her alive when they were not. We don't get to know exactly what that difference was. History doesn't give us that level of precision, but when I look at the record, the consistent movement, the speed and accuracy of her transmissions, the cover story she maintained not just at checkpoints, but in dozens of small daily interactions, the way she handled the roadblock and the betrayal and the wanted posters without losing her composure or her judgment, I think the answer is discipline. Consistent, unwavering, sustained discipline, the kind that most of us only achieve in our best moments. She apparently lived in her best moments for 13 consecutive months. That is not a common human capacity. It is something worth acknowledging plainly. Most people could not do what Yvonne Cormeau did, not because they're cowards, but because the combination of physical toughness, mental precision, emotional control, and sustained performance under existential threat is genuinely rare. We should name it as rare. We should stop pretending that courage is common and that the people who had it in that measure were just doing what anyone would do. They weren't. Most people would have broken somewhere in 13 months. Yvonne did not. There's one more thing I want to say before we close out, and it's about recognition. Because Yvonne Cormeau's story follows a pattern that, if you know your history, you've seen before. The people who actually did the work, who were in the field, who carried the weight and took the risk, often wait a long time to be recognized. Sometimes they're not recognized at all, and sometimes the recognition that does come is pale compared to what was actually earned. The Dutch sisters I've covered. On this channel, Freddie and Truus Overstegen, the teenage girls who shot Nazi collaborators in the forests of the Netherlands, they waited nearly 70 years for their government to formally thank them. 70 years? Because they were communists and the Cold War made that politically inconvenient. The sacrifices they made for their country's freedom were real. The gratitude was delayed by ideology and by politics and by the small-mindedness of people who weren't there. Yvonne Cormeau got her medals. She got her Légion d'honneur, her Croix de Guerre, her MBE. She was recognized, and recognized relatively promptly after the war. But the real, broad public understanding of what she and the other SOE women actually accomplished, that came much later. The films, the TV series, the museum exhibits, the biographies. The gradual dawning recognition that women like Yvonne were not curiosities or footnotes to the real WWII story. They were the real story, or at least a central part of it. There's a generation of men in America, men who grew up during the war or came of age just after it, who were told a version of World War II that had very specific, very defined heroes. The soldiers on the beaches of Normandy, the pilots of the Battle of Britain, the Marines grinding through the Pacific island by island. All of it true, all of it genuinely heroic and worth every honor it has ever been given. But the women who jumped into France with radio sets in suitcases, who cycled 50 kilometers through the French countryside with fake papers and codes written on silk, who kept the resistance networks alive and connected to London for years before those beaches were stormed, they were part of that victory too. Without the intelligence they provided, the supply drops they coordinated, the German infrastructure they helped destroy, Operation Overlord faces a different France. Maybe it works the same way. Maybe it works slower, costs more, bleeds more. We don't get to run history twice to find out. What we do get to do is remember correctly. That means Yvonne Cormeau gets the same space in the story as the men who got the headlines. It means we don't summarize her work as she was a radio operator who helped the French resistance, and then move on in 2 sentences. It means we sit with what 45 kilometers east of Bordeaux on a dark August night in 1943, with false papers and a silk handkerchief full of codes, and a briefcase she would tell you was full of medical equipment, actually means. A woman alone in an occupied country. A government on the other end of a radio signal, and 13 months of perfect work connecting them. 400 perfect messages, 13 months. She disappeared from occupied France the same way she had appeared in it, quietly, professionally, completely in control of the situation. You've been with me for the whole story, and that means more than you know. Before you go, I want to ask you 2 things. First, if this channel has been giving you the kind of history that deserves your time, subscribe. It costs you nothing. It tells me to keep making these. Hit the subscribe button right now and leave a comment below telling me what struck you most about Yvonne's story. Was it the discipline? The cover story with the nurse disguise? The fact that she refused the cyanide pill and was proved right? Was it the X-ray machine at the roadblock? I read all of them, and those comments genuinely shape what I cover next. This channel belongs to the people who watch it. Second thing I want you to do, remember this name, Yvonne Cormeau, not just until the next video. Tell someone, a son, a grandson, a buddy over coffee. Tell them there was a woman who parachuted into Nazi-occupied France alone, ran a clandestine radio operation for 13 months while the Gestapo actively hunted her, and never made a single mistake across 400 transmissions. Tell them she refused a cyanide pill because she didn't plan on needing it. Tell them she got shot in the leg during a German attack on her village and kept going with the radio still in her hands. Tell them she drove into a liberated Toulouse with flags flying from the car window. Not many people know this story, but they should. Yvonne Cormeau coded her last message, packed up her equipment for the final time, and left occupied France in September 1944. She lived until 1997, Christmas Day, as it happens. She was 88 years old. She had outlived the Gestapo. She had outlived every Nazi officer who ever put her face on a wanted poster. She had outlived most of the people on both sides of that war. When she died, her memorial service was attended by representatives from 2 governments because she had served both of them so well. The blood-stained dress is in the Imperial War Museum in London. The briefcase is there too. If you are ever in that city, walk in there and look at them. Stand in front of that display case for a few minutes and think about what those stains mean. There was a human being inside that dress. She was bleeding. She was being shot at. She was running through a village while German soldiers fired. And she was still holding the radio. 1 transmission too long and you're dead. 400 transmissions sent. 0 mistakes made. 13 months of relentless, perfect work. That's Yvonne Cormeau. Codename, Annette. The woman the entire Gestapo apparatus hunted across 13 months of southern France and never once caught.